This is your recipe edit screen. From this screen with no login, you can load a recipe, which will be a changeover. If you log in with the user login of 3 or higher, you can delete a recipe, you can copy, insert, or reorder your recipes, and you can edit a recipe that is not your active. Here, you can change the description and the speed in bags per minute at which this recipe is running. If you click on this case, you can change the case-related adjustments. This one is your conveyor-related adjustments, your conveyor speeds. This is your robot-related adjustments, your delta and your gantry. This is your smart track-related adjustments. This is your bag-related adjustments, so bag size and seal check data. This is your layer parameters, so moving layers, number of rows, etc. And this is your machine adjustment points, so this will be your change points for your changeover. When you click on your case adjustment button, it'll take you to your case setup screen. From this screen, you can view the length, width, height, bottom flap length, and top flap length dimensions. You'll need to be an edit recipe to change these dimensions. The length, width, and height, you can use the arrows here. If you click on these, they will highlight which dimension here you're referring to. The bottom flap length is going to be the flap near the end of the machine when you put the cases on the KD system. It's going to be from the score line to the longest part of the flap. If there's any cutouts, make sure it's the longest part. The top flap length is going to be from the score line to the longest part of the top flap. The label position you can change from active recipe or edit recipe. This is going to be the position of the linear actuator that applies your labels. A higher dimension will be higher up on the case. This goes from 200 millimeters to 60 millimeters at the minimum. Your case code can be changed in active or edit recipe. Your case code, if you have a barcode scanner on a KD system, have to match that value. If you do not, it can just be used as a reference. This button will change your machine from reusable to non-reusable mode. A reusable mode will tuck the bottom flap and the top flap. A non-reusable will not tuck, but will tape instead. When you click here, it'll take you to the conveyor adjustment screen. You have your acceleration conveyor, which is the belt that shoots product into the smart track belt. The smart track conveyor, which is the belt where your smart track is located. Full case exit conveyor is where your cases are fed out of the machine. The vacuum motor is the blower motor for your Delta robot. It's on a percentage here, and we typically run that at 100%. And then the magazine blank conveyor is your KD feed. This is a fixed value, and it will scale depending on how the machine is handling the cases. Each one of these values is in feet per minute and will be based off the motor and gearbox for the maximums and minimums. This is the cassette screen. The cassette screen has two options, both of which will have to be changed from the edit product code screen. So these two indicators down here will tell you what the settings are, but you won't be able to change it from the active screen. So cassette wall move has the cassette wall normally wide while you're loading to give more room to load product, and then will compress either at the last layer, or if this option is active, before the last layer. Before the last layer compress is typically used if you want to force the last layer down, normally along with skip bag on the last layer, so you have more space to place. So this compressed layer, cassette layer to compress, will only be active if this button right here, cassette wall move before last layer, is on, and this indicator here, cassette width during load offset, will only be on if cassette wall move is enabled. So as you can see on this screen, I don't have cassette wall move before last layer on. Your cassette width position is going to be the offset based off of a case dimension for where your cassette is. So 50 to minus 50 on this is the range. A larger number will move your cassette wall in, make it narrower. It's homing out, so putting in a bigger number will make your cassette shrink. Cassette wall width during load offset, so your cassette, if you turn on cassette wall move enabled, this will have an offset position when you're loading, and this offset here is just a offset from your width position offset. So where your width position offset is going to be where you push the product into the case, and this cassette width during load offset is going to be an offset from that. So your range here is going to be minus 50 to 100. This cassette width servo position is just going to be an indicator of the current position of the servo. You have speeds, so the load speed is going to be the speed where it moves in if you're doing a cassette width offset during load, and the unload speed is going to be if you're on the return move when it's coming back out. The speed range is going to be 50 to 1,000, and the speed accel is going to be 500 to 3,000. Typically the accel is set almost maximum, and the speed is normally pretty close to that. For the loading ram screen, there's a few options that we need to go over before we go through the parameters in detail. First, the tipper handoff position on ram retract versus extend. So that's going to be this setting right here. And what that tells it is when the loading ram is pushing out, when is the tipper going to start to back up and get out of the way? Typically we want it on extend. Retract is an option if you want to keep the case there longer. The idea with this setting is that you can, if you're having problems with the stack falling over, you can keep the tipper in place longer and let the ram push and retract some more. The range on this loading ram to tipper handoff is going to be 0 to 400, or it's going to be your retract position to 710, but the typical setting for this is going to be 450, and it's typically on extend. Compress mode enabled or disabled. Your compress mode is from your retract position. So your retract position is your loading ram back and can be set from 0 to 300. Your compress and cassette offset will show up if compress is enabled, and this will start the loading ram further back, and then once you hit a certain layer, it'll move the loading ram up to the product. The idea with this is you can place further back in the cassette without any issue of the hose on the delta hitting the loading ram. So the compress and cassette offset, you have a range of 0 to 200, and that's just going to be how far forward the loading ram moves once you hit the layer to compress on layer. Ram tilt and tilt before last layer kind of go together. Ram tilt is going to have the pneumatic that tilts the loading ram and the cassette down, and then if you turn on tilt before last layer, once you hit a certain layer, it's going to tilt up. If it tilt before last layer isn't on, this is going to tilt up while pushing. The idea of this function is to allow for you to build a tighter stack, get closer to the loading ram, and it's typically used for small products with a high count. The layer to tilt up on is this option right here, and you'll only see it if tilt before last layer is on. So the settings that we didn't talk about, delay before ram retract. So this is going to be when you push out, how long you wait there before you start to come back. The range is 0 to 2,500 milliseconds. I typically set this at 0 unless I need the loading ram to kind of settle the product. Tooling ID is just going to be the ID on the loading ram that's etched on the plate. Product compress position offset is going to be how far past the score line you go when you're pushing out your product. So this has a range of 0 to 120. I typically see it set pretty high, around 100 to 120, and this is a calculated position where your loading ram will push to the score line and how far you want to go past that to try and shove the product into the case. We talked about layer to tilt up on, we talked about loading ram tipper handoff. This here is just your current loading ram servo position. It's not an adjustment point, it's just an indicator. The loading ram speed, accel, and decel are all going to be your loading speed. The range for these is, for the speed, 50 to 5,000, and for the accel and decel, 50 to 15,000. Same with the retract speed. So loading is when the loading ram is going out, and retracting is when the loading ram is coming in. Typically these are set around 1500, and the accel and decel will be 3,000 to 8,000. Loading speed will normally be a little bit slower than the retracting speed. So as you can see, the product code that I was recently testing, these are the settings. So 1500, 3000, 6000, 2300, 8000, 8000. And based on your settings, some of the parameters that we just discussed will be there or won't be there. This is the case tipper screen. On this screen you have 3 numeric inputs and then 1 option. Everything else you see in gray is just an indicator of speeds. The start position offset is going to be where the tipper is when the gantry places the case onto it. The range on this is going to be -30 all the way up to the position where the case will sit before it does its final move onto the cassette. So in this case it's 123, and that's the maximum. Case load position offset is going to be the position at which the tipper holds the case for the handoff from the cassette, where the loading ram will push. This has a range of -30 to 30, and this is typically adjusted if your cassette fingers aren't opening properly or aren't catching the flaps properly. Handoff speed offset is used to change the skew of the case when the case is being handed off to the sealer belts. So this is a scaled speed offset where the tipper will either speed up or slow down when it's handing off the case to the belts. A slower speed will bring the top forward, and a faster speed will bring the bottom forward. The range on this is 30 to -30. The last thing here is an option: slow down taper belts to tipper handoff. So if you have time and you are having issues handing off the case into the taper belts, this option can be enabled. What it does is slow down the taper belts down to 20 feet per minute when it's handing off, which it's typically at 60 feet per minute, and it'll allow for a slower, cleaner handoff between the belts. And then everything else on the screen is non-adjustable. It's just an indicator.